Brilliant. Well, good morning, and thank you so much to those of you who made it in person today. We've also joined by, I think lots of people are joining online for this one, including one of our speakers. And I'm delighted to say that the event online is being translated into Ukrainian and into Polish. So I'm going to take that as a reminder to myself to speak perhaps slightly slower than I normally do, and even perhaps some shorter sentences. My name is Hannah Richards. I'm the Communications Director for the Disasters Emergency Committee here in the UK, and I'm honoured to be here to chair this meeting. I've even been encouraged to make a few remarks of my own where appropriate, so I'll take advantage of that. We're obviously here today to talk about narratives and the central role that they continue to play in the humanitarian response to the invasion of Ukraine. But firstly, I want to give a quick introduction for those who may not be familiar with the work of the Humanitarian Policy Group. The Humanitarian Policy Group at ODI Global is one of the world's leading think tanks and dedicated to reforming, informing, and improving assistance for people affected by conflict and crises. HPG rigorous research, high quality policy analysis, and significant convening to advance more inclusive, effective, and accountable action. HPG works primarily on protracted conflict and long-standing engagement on protection, displacement, gender, inclusion and accountability, humanitarian system reform and climate, anticipatory action and livelihoods. Partnership and collaboration are key to HPG's success, and that's why we're thrilled that so many can join us today for this event, both on the panel, here in the room, and online. The report and this event form part of some vital ongoing work that HPG have been doing on the role of narratives in the humanitarian sector. But before we get into that, there are inevitably a few housekeeping notes, particularly for the people in the room. We are not scheduled to have a fire alarm. We're not expecting a test. So if the alarm goes off, it's not a test. Please leave the room without your belongings and head outside of the office to the left under the railway bridge. If you're online, stay where you are, you're all right. But if you are online, there is a question and answer box. So please do use this function and get these questions in. We'll be coming to you for input later on. Now, I'd like to introduce an excellent panel. Joining us today online is Aga Kosowicz, President of the Polish Migration Forum, Sarah Red, Advocacy Campaigns and Engagement Manager for Oxfam, Mariana Zawiska, Research and Portfolio Lead for Open Space Works Ukraine, and John Bryant, Research Fellow at the Humanitarian Policy Group in ODI Global. And we'll also have some closing remarks from Sylvia Colonna, the Head of Humanitarian Law and Policy at the British Red Cross. So we've got a full range of things happening. The lens we're looking through today in our discussion are narratives. What do we mean by narratives? Could mean anything, let's be honest. We all know that evidence alone is not sufficient to effect change, and instead awareness needs to be raised and opinions need to shift through building a common understanding of the problem and the proposed solutions. Narratives are central to that effort, and they can be understood as stories with a purpose. And while misinformation and disinformation always need to be at the front of our minds when discussing any modern war or crises, narratives are not intrinsically bad. They're an essential part of communicating and the work that we're all involved with. I'm a director of communications. It's not just the work of communications. I can warrant that it's all of us. Rather than stand in opposition to empirical evidence, they're crucial in complementing them. As humanitarians, we all have a role and a responsibility to combine evidence with narratives and stories to drive positive change for the people we claim to be acting in the interest of. I was really excited to be asked to be chair today. As a communications director in the humanitarian sector, the one thing I feel really acutely at the moment is that this is really, really hard. Narratives are so hard. They're hard to get right. It's very hard to stay aware of and try and mitigate for the unintended consequences of your communications, the words you use, the things you say. And there's often very little space in which to convey a narrative. The humanitarian organizations have a small voice in a large picture of setting what these narratives are. And often the spaces where our words are being used aren't the places that are most high profile. I'm really aware that lots of the communications I'm most proud of are the things that people see the least. And it's also true, when I was reflecting on this, that every word counts. One example of this, I think, particularly for the Disasters Emergency Committee, was the name of the appeal that we launched for Ukraine. Many of you will know it's called the Ukraine Humanitarian Appeal. And we put out lots of comms, as you can imagine. It was an enormously successful appeal that was picked up, and the general public in the UK really ran with it. But there was lots of back and forth about whether to include the word humanitarian in the title. I'll be honest, the fundraisers weren't keen. It wasn't going to work well for the design. It was wordy. I know that perhaps people in this room and online are very comfortable with the word humanitarian and what it means. I don't think it's a very powerful word that resonates a lot with a lot of the general public in the UK. So we had some back and forth. But when it came to it, often the only messaging that the DEC was in control of was the title. I remember walking into craft shops in the middle of the Lake District, and they were raising money for the Ukraine Humanitarian Appeal. They're not using an image, they're not using a logo, they're not using any of our words to describe the fundraising efforts or the crisis itself. But by including the word humanitarian in that title, we had at least conveyed some of what we were hoping to convey about what the appeal was doing. It's not that every single word matters quite as much as that one did, but it was a stark reflection for me that we have to be cognizant of all of the words that we're choosing to use. So the fact that it's really hard actually makes reports like the one we're talking about today even more important. That it's hard doesn't mean that we should say nothing at all. We should not be disheartened. It just means that we need to think about it. And so I hope today what we can do is reflect deeply across our organisations on the importance of narratives. So without further ado, I would like to hand over to two of the report authors, to John and to Mariana, to give an introduction to the report.
Thanks so much. Thank you, Hannah. Before I hand over to Mariana, who will give us a summary of the key findings, some of the key findings from the report, I just wanted to sort of introduce our part in this as HPG and maybe answer the kind of why now question for this research. So we're going to present some findings from research, as Hannah says, looking at narratives around the war in Ukraine and their implications for humanitarian action. So the work explores how stories and frames of issues like vulnerability and resilience and principles and solidarity have all come together in the Ukraine response in ways that have sometimes caused tension, but have also brought sometimes new lessons to learn here and for other crises as well. So we'll be presenting findings from the final report, which was published a few weeks ago in English. Polish and Ukrainian translations are on their way. A quick word on the study itself. So it used a mixed methods approach, combining a large amount of more limited survey responses and a smaller number of longer form interviews. So we used a qualitative survey tool called SenseMaker for the survey component. So there were over 600 responses to that, combined with over 80 key informant interviews. That's then backed up with our kind of bread and butter that we do, at HPG, which is like, desk-based research and all the and other methods as well. So combined, it's been a pretty substantive piece of work. So it's the end of a 2-year project that has been generously supported by the British Red Cross. And it's part of wider HPG work and a wider HPG lens that looks at the role of narratives more generally in the humanitarian sector. So we've covered how they interact with evidence and how they drive policy processes. And if you're interested in learning more, I'd encourage you to look at our other case studies. So we have one on cash and voucher assistance and the growth of that. We have one on the role of feminist foreign policy. And we have one on the role of Germany as an aid donor as well. So in terms of why now for this particular piece, so generally, as Hannah was saying, I think that the role of humanitarian organizations is to, I suppose, raise awareness of emerging crises in quite a crowded kind of media landscape. And if we think back to, at least in Europe in 2022, what humanitarian organizations faced was quite a different situation in some ways. So at that time, there was, relatively speaking, high media coverage of Ukraine and the invasion. And there were declarations of solidarity as well that I think from a humanitarian perspective, I think caught a few organizations a little bit off guard in terms of quite the level of partisan support from countries like the UK and across Europe for Ukraine. Perhaps more importantly, or just importantly, the invasion wasn't presented specifically as a humanitarian crisis. This speaks to exactly what you were saying. Or often the humanitarian element seemingly played only quite a minor role in how the response to the war was sort of prescribed and how the war was depicted. So we thought this would be a great moment to apply that narrative lens, and some of the lessons we're drawing from we've taken from that earlier work and apply it specifically to this response. And like every aid context, and this is, I'm sure, what Mariana and other colleagues will speak to, you had the international aid sector arriving in places that, of course, had civil societies and responders of their own, like every context. They had narratives of what was happening, an understanding of what their role was, and our intention was to explore those dynamics as well, with the aim of being constructive and ultimately supporting effective, locally led humanitarian action. And just a final note from me on that, the research at times has led us to, I think, quite a lot of sensitive issues for different people, different organizations. It explores how people work, some of their the tensions in how they sort of, we all try to work together. But the team and I have been really appreciative of how, and many of them are in this room, of how openly humanitarians and other interviewees have discussed some of these issues with us. And this is intended to be a constructive piece that acknowledges that there are a lot of trade-offs and issues to be carefully navigated. As Hannah said, this is hard, and we really, really acknowledge that. And I hope that this is received with the spirit it's intended, really, just to be constructive. I'll hand over to Mariana now, who's looking more at the research itself. So thanks.
Yeah, I think I have a really challenging part to present. My estimation is in 8 minutes. A lot of findings we have in this piece we worked on during 2 years. So I will probably only scratch the surface with some key findings we have in the report, and then maybe in the discussions or questions we could dig deeper into it. I will start with some thoughts regarding the title of our panel, which is Victims or Resistors, Lessons from Ukraine. I feel like the key lesson and the key innovative finding from this research is that victims and resistors, that is something that we observed a lot in interviews, but also, and I think what's more important, also in the responses we received through the survey, which targeted mostly those who were directly engaged into the response, and I think 2 quarters, or so more than half of the responses were targeting Ukrainians in Ukraine, in Poland, and in UK. So Ukrainians themselves also reported that they see themselves as victims and as resistors. So we definitely saw this mixture of attitudes to Ukrainians in all 3 countries by different actors, international aid workers, local aid workers, but also by people themselves. Of course, we analyzed, as John said, a lot of the appeals and public communication campaigns, which usually used the image of Ukrainians as in other contexts and in other crises as those who are super vulnerable. So these are the images of women with kids, of destroyed houses, of refugees on the border, stacking in lines, and refugees arriving in Poland. But also this was really contrasting with what Ukrainians or how Ukrainians perceive themselves, and also how the whole situation and Ukrainians were covered by broader media. As Hannah mentioned at the beginning, so the picture of Ukrainians and the crisis in general media and also in the political discourse that was not so much related to humanitarian and used the word humanitarian, that was more about the invasion, about the geopolitical situation, and as John mentioned, about solidarity within the global context, but also specifically within Europe and on the borders with Poland. So yeah, when we wanted to understand the tension that is there between the narratives of vulnerability and resistance, we were looking into some specific aspects, how the vulnerability is shown by or is perceived by Ukrainians themselves and by Ukrainian organizations. And we received a lot of comments and feedback about this part of the invisible vulnerability, so that yes, from one hand, Ukrainians are shown as resistant, as those who resist Russian invasion, those who are coming together to help each other, to provide mutual support, those who are fundraising as diaspora groups in Poland and UK. But also on the other hand, we've seen and heard a lot of this invisible vulnerability that is not so present in media communications and political discourse. We have, let's say, 4 key observations related to how vulnerability is perceived, and I will start with one which is not very obvious, and I think that was surprise for me personally, but also for the team, the vulnerability related to psychological pressure inside Ukraine for those who stay in the country, and moreover, the pressure that is faced by Ukrainian actors and Ukrainian organizations working inside. That is felt and also reported in the interviews as a huge double pressure that local frontline workers in Ukraine, but also I must say as well is in Poland, those who used to work on the border, they were facing. So that is this double pressure of living in the country during the war, feeling on themselves all the effect of the war, being in touch with their friends and family members who are either defending the country or stay on the occupied territories or live on the frontline areas. And on the other hand, the, let's say, level of responsibility that Ukrainian organizations, aid workers face, so that they can't just leave their communities. And this is specifically felt in our interviews with aid workers who originally come from frontline regions or frontline communities and continue staying there with their family members, creating different structures for mutual support, for humanitarian assistance in these communities. The, let's say, second observations regarding the vulnerability is this gender dynamics of displacement that we've seen, and the perception of ideal refugee that was reported in many interviews in Poland and Ukraine. So Ukrainians, as depicted in many appeals, were represented as a woman with children, either an older woman or an older couple who, yeah, also are fleeing from direct threat from the armed conflict. We also seen a lot of, let's say, racial dynamics regarding the Ukrainian refugees, and the I think we noted this idea of deservedness or deserved support towards some groups of refugees from Ukraine, those who are representing minorities, and also, as Hannah mentioned, every word matters. We noted a lot of this tension between texts which have the notion of Ukrainians fleeing Ukraine to the contrast of refugees from Ukraine, also underlying that not only Ukrainians are affected by the war in Ukraine, and also other minorities who used to live in Ukraine, but also those who were asylum seekers in Ukraine before the full-scale invasion. They let's say, were less covered as those who deserve assistance and deserve support and deserve being hosted in European countries. Inside Ukraine, there is, and it feels like the tension is growing, the tension around the displacement status. So the people who are internally displaced from frontline communities and occupied territories, they have a specific legal status of internally displaced person, and they are arriving in host communities who are also feeling the effect of the war, the economic toll, also the effect on social cohesion, hosting people from other communities, the military recruitment, and so on and so on. So this tension between those who have a formal displacement status and arrive in host communities, and those people who are originally from host communities and need support as well, that was clearly visible during our research. The tension also is increasing around the status since March 2024, when governmental payments were decreased for internally displaced people, also focusing on those who are most vulnerable from the perspective of the state, and not focusing on those who are leaving a lot of internally displaced people who need rent their housing, who need to ensure some basic needs without support in host communities. And for sure, we also have observed some vulnerability tension or tensions around vulnerability in Poland and UK around the housing schemes that were introduced in both countries, which were built around the idea of hospitality, welcome of refugees, and mutual support. However, leaving many Ukrainians unprotected and vulnerable in this situation, being dependent from their host, for their hosts in UK. Going, and I'm following the time, getting to the end, I will again underline that when we focus only on the vulnerability perspective or dimension of depicting Ukrainian refugees, that's really disempowering, and we lose a lot of potential to let's say, make more visible the mutual support, community support, to recognize the self-help initiatives that were implemented both in Ukraine, but also by our Polish colleagues and the diaspora groups in hosting countries. But on the other side, when we focus only on the resistance aspect, that's makes us, so that makes a lot of vulnerabilities or people who need support invisible. And one of our, I must say, like, favorite, but not really favorite quotes from the research is that some of the respondents shared that vulnerability and resistance, it's really something that it's not or, it's and, it comes at the same time. But the resistance in Ukraine inside, it comes at a cost, and that's very important to recognize the costs that stay behind the resistance. Getting to the end of my part, I would say that, and getting back to the narratives, we've also seen that many narratives we observed during our research, they are really interconnected. So the narrative of vulnerability versus resistance is really connected to the narratives of principled humanitarian response and neutrality, the narrative of exceptionalism, the crisis in Ukraine seen as exceptional, and refugees from Ukraine seen as not the refugees as from other crises. That is also pretty much connected to the narratives around localization and, let's say, trying to depict local actors as success stories for localization, not recognizing that they also need support in terms of infrastructure support, psychological support, and other types of assistance to sustain their work in Ukraine and Poland. Ending my part of this panel, I would say that the most important message we wanted to send with this report is that it's really important for humanitarian actors to recognize what are the narratives in every crisis, and the narratives we've seen in Ukraine, they can definitely be a basis for learning to other crises. And also it's important to recognize for humanitarian actors that they are not only following the narratives of public media or political discourse, but also shaping the narratives by themselves in their appeals, in the public communication, in their interaction with local partners in the country. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, both of you. I could have actually listened to that all morning, so I'm sure there'll be lots of questions coming up at the end. So do note them down. Don't forget what you want to come back to John and Mariana on. I'd really like to bring in Aga now. Online. So last month, Poland announced its new migration strategy, which included the possibility of suspending access to asylum procedures. The Polish Migration Forum does extensive work supporting anyone with refugee or migration experience who resides in Poland, including Ukrainians, but also other groups. Through that work, you're seeing daily the impact of differing narratives and policies for different groups of refugees. I wonder if you could tell us a bit about why do you think that different narratives have emerged about who's deserving of assistance?
First of all, let me share one comment after Mariana's contribution, that I feel that we also have another layer in our discussion that is past tense. It stuns me that oftentimes talking about the humanitarian response or Ukrainian humanitarian response, we tend to look somehow backwards, while from the Polish perspective, we have a completely different perspective, because this is an everyday reality, and this is also an everyday reality for the Ukrainian colleagues and aid workers and the people. And I think that I'm mentioning this because I guess that perspective is key, and that this huge diversity of narratives is a result of basically many actors with very many viewpoints, many perspectives, also many objectives and goals. And most of all, I think audiences. So in this migration strategy discourse, we clearly see that aid workers or the Polish public understood as the response of humanitarian activists or anybody involved in the response are not the audience for the migration strategy. We clearly see that from the political perspective, EU is the audience, maybe the Polish voters are the audience, and this strategy is not created to really resolve problems that we see here and now, or propose some kind of, agenda and roadmap for Poland to address the challenges that are posed by migration, the Ukrainian response, but also in a wider sense. It is perceived as a political tool and mechanism that is aimed at putting the public at peace, so to say, and also to somehow support the Poland's role on the EU arena. And this is not guesswork on my part, because the politicians and authors of this document themselves highlight that they want our approach, Polish approach to migration, including the suspension of the right to asylum, to be somehow mainstreamed or to I don't know, maneuver this concept into the wider EU dialogue. I think for our Polish perspective, maybe to give you a little background, it is important that the Ukrainian response kind of didn't appear on a blank page. In Poland, we had a series of crises that preceded the war, the full-scale invasion, I mean. Because in 2021, there was the crisis that started in the Polish-Belarusian border, which provoked also a lot of narratives. Shortly after, Poland evacuated 1,000 people from Afghanistan straight from Kabul. That also provoked another set of narratives. We did have a significant number of refugees and migrants prior to all those events that also generated a narrative. So arrival of the Ukrainian refugees and migrants were just a fourth, I would say, layer to our work and fourth layer to the discourse. And it was very difficult somehow to find logic and somehow, understand what is happening, because those narratives were dramatically different. It's as it was indicated in the report, oftentimes refugees from Ukraine were presented as some kind of different setup or special people. Even the language used by the government at that time was putting a significant difference between the refugees and persons arriving from Ukraine, avoiding the word refugee. So often the government referred to the people as guests, friends from Ukraine, war refugees, or somehow coming up with even a different vocabulary to describe the people that are coming and highlighting how different they are. Thinking about these stories with a purpose also. I must say that I was very shocked to hear yesterday from one of the authors of the report that localization, for example, is perceived, and there is a narrative about localization being a success story. Because from our perspective and thinking about the local narratives that we have in Poland, this is far from being a success story. Where we find ourselves right now is a difficult place where we talk about the response in the past sense, while we still have people at our doorstep, and we are expected to provide assistance and run the humanitarian response in the scenario and narrative that talks about basically the challenge and the response to be coming to an end. This is how it is perceived. We also, I would like to also strengthen what Mariana said about personal cost and setup that people live in, because we talk about vulnerabilities, we talk about resilience. We don't talk that much about the fact that the response is done predominantly with the hands of people who are the victims and who are expected to be resilient. Within the Polish organizations, I would estimate that maybe half of the staff has migrant background. And we are talking about resolving a humanitarian response with the hands of people that are affected. And I don't think that this is a narrative that is present enough. For example, talking about psychological burden, we don't realize that it's like, if we were to write a marathon with people that just have one leg. We are talking about people that are themselves in need of strengthening and supporting, and they are resilient, but also they are vulnerable. We're talking about people who provide legalization help, but themselves are not legalized or in the process of legalization, for example. So it's this picture kind of, if you look very deeply into the ground, it's very, very difficult. Hearing the government narratives is tough for us, because this painting this picture that we are done, that we have managed, that everything was fine, that we've learned our lessons. We don't feel that we have benefited from previous lessons. I'm happy that there can be lessons drawn from the Polish experience, and I'm sure that there are very many. But at the same time, I think that this is not also a narrative that is being told enough, that we have not benefited from previous crises enough. It's while the international actors arrived to Poland having experienced 3, 4, 5, 6 other crises globally, this knowledge and competence was not really fully transferred. And this learning process has not benefited us as local aid workers. And I think that if we expect the Polish example to benefit somebody else in the future, it does require really thoughtful, in-depth process and an effort, so that this is possible. Because right now, what I can see is a narrative also that the states take over, that international presence is no longer necessary, that all the international actors can withdraw, because now it's a time for the state to take over, or I don't know, EU structures to take over. But this is not happening soon enough. So we are de facto losing the capacity and the wisdom or experience that was accumulated over the last 3 years. And it is not being transferred or somehow, accumulated or processed in a systemic way, neither by the state, neither by the humanitarian sector, from my perspective.
You're absolutely right to remind us, actually, that this is ongoing and we're still in the process. There's still work to be done in terms of shaping narratives for this crisis. And it sounds like you've got some really challenging current narratives going on in Poland even today. I wonder if you've got any examples of how you're working to try and challenge and reshape these.
We find ourselves in a somewhere, torn apart, two narratives that are predominant right now. One of them, I would call this political narrative of securitization, externalization, everything that happens with Rwanda and Italy, Albania, and kind of thinking about how can we get rid of migrants, to be very blunt, in EU, which is also a narrative that is repeated in Poland. How can we limit, organize, control, and basically be in charge of migration and limit the numbers? And the other narrative that we see is, I would say, an economic narrative, which talks about the needs of the labor market, or how people benefit our economies, or how people pay taxes, how they contribute to the system, and how necessary they are. And we have both those narratives present in Poland, and I know that they are also present in other EU countries. And we try to somehow squeeze our perspective somewhere in the middle. For us, it is difficult, and I think we are in a learning process, to be frank. I can't tell you that we have a very good solution. What we have done, we have prepared as a migration consortium an NGO migration policy. So we have drafted a policy that is value-based, that talks about human rights, that talks about the dignity of people, building community, and how people should live together peacefully. At the same time, we see how our value-based language doesn't resonate globally. So we are in a process of learning or exploring or trying to find a language that would make us more visible or more heard. And it is difficult. I mean, what we hear from the people that we talk to even is that we need to learn to use a language of benefit, or language of how people can be useful, or how an approach can be useful for the society, how we can contribute. But it is very difficult for someone who thinks with the, Declaration of Human Rights in mind, and have this shift from values to benefits. Is a process that we are right now going through. We see obvious alliances. So, for example, for us right now to talk with the business who talks about economic needs or economic necessities that are de facto pro-migrant, we have to somehow also rethink or find new ways to cooperate with business, keeping in mind migrants' abuse on the labor market, people that are being underpaid or not paid or abused or trafficked for work. So we have to find new alliances and new languages, new approaches, and without compromising our values, because the values is clearly something that people are not eager to hear anymore, which is difficult, because the values are also something that motivates us to work. So how to find ourselves in a balanced position in this new situation? It is a true challenge, and we are in the process.
Brilliant. I think that idea of finding the space between two very powerful narratives and trying to carve out a bigger space and using language that works to broaden that space is a really interesting concept that we can come back to in the questions. Sarah, I'd like to bring you in now. Oxfam is one organisation that's been prioritising working with local civil society organisations who are already supporting communities impacted by war as a part of their response. How important do you think this is in helping to shift the narratives and tell stories that reflect the realities of affected communities?
Thank you. Thank you for the opportunity to contribute to the discussion and for the researchers for this report. I think many of the findings are extremely relevant to people like myself who, through advocacy and communication, play a part in either generating or reinforcing certain narratives. And it's a responsibility that we need to consider deeply in how we approach our work. The Ukraine response has highlighted the importance of local actors and international partnerships, building on years of advocacy for localization globally. I think that as a humanitarian community, the emphasis on the role of local actors has certainly contributed towards the perceptions and the narratives around Ukrainian resilience. And it's a really important step forward in recognizing the leading role that affected communities themselves play in responding to humanitarian needs. And the report reminds us that when we talk about local humanitarian actors, who we're actually talking about is often people who themselves are affected by the crisis personally. It's one of the reasons that they're best placed to understand the needs of their communities. But as has been said, it takes a toll. It can take a toll. We published a report earlier this year about the role of women's rights organisations in the response, and burnout was a significant issue facing most of the organisations that we spoke to. With the kind of benefits of talking about local actors more and more, some of the findings are quite concerning, though, on how narratives of resilience can overshadow vulnerabilities of affected people, especially as we know that the most vulnerable in crisis are already often unheard and overlooked in humanitarian responses. As the report rightly points out, many people talk about Ukraine being a success story or a turning point for localization, and Aga is quite right. It is far from the case. Quality funding for local organizations is insufficient, and it's difficult to track, especially the amount and quality of funding coming through intermediaries and the amount of funding going to women's rights organizations. Meaningful participation in decision-making is not much better. The recent localization baseline study showed that policy influence is the furthest behind on the localization markers. And you only need to look at the lack of inclusion of Ukrainian civil society in the Ukraine recovery conferences, in the senior officials meeting in Brussels, just to see how far behind we are. So I think the report references that local organisations have characterised localisation as a frustration, and you can really understand it. So I think as Oxfam, our response, we recognise that the importance of all of this and a commitment to building on the years of progress that towards localizations and putting the principles into action. Since the outset of the crisis, we established a time-bound response, and we weren't present in the region before, so we were specifically focusing on supporting local actors to support their communities and enable their leadership and sustainability into the future. We're focusing with working with women's rights organisations and those who respond to the needs of marginalised communities like LGBT communities and Roma-led organisations. And as we move into the second phase of our crisis response and our strategy, we're planning a gradual and responsible exit from Ukraine, which is motivated by the desire for local actors to take the lead. And we need to recognise that in order to do that, internationals like ourselves need to step back. And it's a bit of a new approach for us in Ukraine, and it's certainly not perfect, but it's been made possible due to Oxfam's long-standing commitments to local humanitarian leadership and feminist approaches. But it's also been made possible by the flexible funding that we've been afforded in the Ukraine response because of the generous appeals that were generated in 2022. And when the report talks about the value of organisations like Oxfam, and I think that certainly in Ukraine, it's been supporting organisations to navigate the humanitarian crisis response and the ability to adapt and respond. But it's also about using our power and voice to amplify the experiences of local communities and stepping back ourselves in order to push for their leadership in decision making. Aga mentioned about learning from global crises and other international actors around the world. And I think as Oxfam, with connections to lots of different crises around the world and partners around the world, another important component is enabling and facilitating kind of mutual learning with other local actors globally through things like the Charter for Change initiative. But it is also recognition that localization can't be achieved in Ukraine alone. It requires global system reform and a shift in approach from international actors. And then I suppose when we identify the report talks a bit about some of the tensions that have come out between international and local actors, and I think on this, when identifying partners, there's already a decision that we make to work with partners that align with our values. So for Oxfam, that's feminism, it's inclusion, it's anti-racism. But I think learning from Ukraine and elsewhere, we need to recognise and reconcile that equal partnerships doesn't have to always mean being fully aligned or fully agreeing on everything, and that we need to recognise the value that each party brings to the partnership, and respecting that when we take different positions, we have a space to be able to talk about it and to have discussions in a kind of respectful manner that is based on equality. So yeah, I suppose just to talk a bit more about the question of how an INGO like Oxfam fits into narratives and the way that they're created and reinforced in humanitarian crisis. We certainly need to recognise our power and our responsibility in this. Narratives do have an implication on political decision-making and budget allocation. INGOs are seen as a trusted source by politicians, by media outlets, by the public. So we have a responsibility to communicate the realities for many people around the world that often go unheard. That counts for Ukraine, so highlighting the needs of communities that are more vulnerable, that maybe are not so visible, as the report points out, but also globally. So, for example, 9 out of 10 neglected crises are in Africa. So we have to have a responsibility to use our resources to amplify those voices. And as Hannah, you were saying at the beginning, it requires thoughtful and principled communications and advocacy in order to not undermine the affected communities or local actors, and to showcase the nuances of the experience of crisis. So both the vulnerabilities that are caused by inequality that are exacerbated by crisis, as well as the ways that communities are responding and supporting one another. And I would just finish on the fact that the report and the recommendations really are food for thought for somebody like myself who is in advocacy and communication, and the role that I play and that we play as professionals in the humanitarian ecosystem, and how these narratives are shaped and formed and reinforced, and the responsibility that we have with that.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. I was actually fortunate enough to visit one of Oxfam's projects in Poland, which was working with Roma communities, who particularly those who'd come across the border from Ukraine, but also in the host community. And I think, it's very clear Oxfam's approach in the way that they're delivering their response. And I suppose going back to an earlier point of how do we find that space that Aga was talking about in between what works in a narrative in our own audiences in the countries in which we're trying to communicate, but taking on board what local organizations, local actors want in that communication, and finding that space in the middle is a real challenge. And then how do we get it amplified? So I think that is something that we're all looking at, how we can continue to do it better. So now it is your chance to ask some questions. There's one hand already. Very exciting. This is good. I will come to the room first and probably take about 3 questions. Again, depending on how long there are, we'll either do 3 at once and then come back, or if they're very detailed, we'll maybe do 1 at a time. And if you're online, get your questions ready. We're going through them because you are up next.
Thank you. Hello. Thank you very much. And it's really amazing to listen from you, to hear from you. I'm very curious. These are actually the spontaneous questions. I had some prepared, but this is a spontaneous one. So I'm very curious. Saren Jarosz, Migration Consortium. I also had the pleasure to work with you on this report. And I had the question about these invisible actor shaping narratives that Aga mentioned a bit, but I'm curious on this actor, which is a state in shaping narratives, how humanitarian sector, how local organizations, act upon and sometimes counteract upon the narratives that the state shapes about the humanitarian response. Because from their perspective, I know the Polish case in which we just discovered that state was, I would say, the invisible actor of those narratives, not engaging with the humanitarian sector on some superficial level, engaging with the local communities and organizations in a very instrumental way. And I'm very curious, what is your experience? And now, actually, to all of you, I'm curious about the humanitarian diplomacy and negotiations with the state from the humanitarian perspective in this response. Did this exceptionalism of this crisis change something in your approach to the state actors? And a little bit more general question to all of you, actually, especially to actually John, Mariana, and Karen, and Sasha, who is also here. Hello, and Aga. I'm curious about, we work on these 2 years, and I'm curious what differences you saw between our cases in this way. What surprised you? What was this one difference that you saw that is special about or present or not present in our comparative respective cases? Thank you very much.
Great. I'm going to count that as 3 in 1. We will still do 3 questions in the room, but I think it probably is enough to come back to people. So thinking about the role of invisible actors and humanitarian diplomacy in engaging with those invisible actors, and what surprised you most. Mariana?
I was going to suggest Sarah, actually.
Go on.
Oh, were you?
Yeah, no, just specifically on the humanitarian diplomacy point. We can talk more about the easier question.
Great. You want to take diplomacy and invisible actors, then we'll hand over to these for their surprises.
Yeah, I think it varies, right? And Aga can talk much more about this, but I mean, in terms of the situation in Ukraine and the Ukrainian government's contribution as a narrative setter on the humanitarian response, that's quite different from, say, for example, from the Polish government's influence on narratives at the Poland-Belarus border, right? I think that some are visible and some are more invisible. But for example, the narratives that are being driven around the crisis at the Polish-Belarus border are being reinforced and utilized by both governments and kind of political actors. And it's a challenge for civil society and the NGOs that are working at that border. So maybe it's interesting to ask Aga actually about how I think it's quite contrasting, and it's an interesting case in point of kind of the how different crises and different narratives are at play when you have those contrasts next to one another.
Aga?
It is super interesting to follow this discrepancy, because sometimes it even affected the same individual border guards who had a different approach to the border, I don't know, 20 kilometers up north in the Belarusian end, or Polish-Belarusian border, and completely different approach and reactions and activities were taken by the same individuals on the Polish-Ukrainian border. So it's on individual state official level, we could see a very big discrepancy, and also, of course, also on the level of narratives. For me, astonishing thing is that the government somehow doesn't see the relation between the narratives that they take on each other, some kind of relationship between or how narratives affect kind of cross effects things. So, for example, the government would use this anti-migrant narrative on the Polish-Belarusian border, and then be surprised that following this anti-migrant narrative around the Polish-Belarusian border, women from Ukraine are beaten up on the street by xenophobic individuals, right? And somehow even the intention of the government was to limit the anti-migrant or xenophobic rhetorics to the Polish-Belarusian border, but it spills. I mean, somehow it was astonishing for me, this lack of understanding that if you fuel anger or if you fuel dismay among the population is not so refined to just hate a certain part of the migrant population. So these feelings that you fuel are overarching later for the entire setup. And somehow this is astonishing that the government doesn't see it, and also that it happens, because it is kind of a common sense thing that it will. But I wanted, in response to the question, I wanted to also draw another parallel and ask you to imagine a volcano, because thinking about the state and localization, I think I would like to propose a term, delocalization, because I think that this is what is happening. It is as if this response to the humanitarian Ukrainian challenge was as if it was a volcano. Like, you have the magma that melts, and then you have all this fluid, red, moving thing. Somehow we felt like that over those last 2 years, that things are possible with the government, that we can actually communicate, that we can use our experiences to develop systemic solutions. And we had these discourses, I don't know, for example, with the Ministry of Education. How can we accommodate refugee migrant children to the school system? Now, as local actors, we feel as if this magma and this, red moving substance somehow is cooling down and getting stiff. And we are in a moment where we feel that the systems that have become temporarily elastic and moving and possible to change and affect go back to their previous state, which is still. And this is a huge disappointment, I must say, and worry right now. But we see the same phenomenon on many angles. We see that international organizations are proposed even by the government to take a managing or overarching roles. And we see how it is tempting, and it may be tempting for big international actors, also UN agencies, to localize. It's like all this process for the last 2 years was about giving capacity, giving money to the locals. Now we observe somewhat a reverse process where the previous set of big people would like to sit again at the table with other big people. And somehow we are not on a table. And this is something that is of concern. And I found it very interesting what Sarah said about like what localization is, because I don't think we had this conversation actually in Poland. We never had really a good understanding. What are we talking about? I mean, it is obvious that we talk about money, how much percent of the funding goes to the local partners or who cooperates with whom, but what do we identify as a good localization? I mean, Sarah mentioned money and impact or meaningful participation, she said. And it's excellent identification of what are the components of localizations, but the question is it all to it? Or are we expecting something else? And what? And for example, for me, this idea of longer term perspective and thinking about what happens with the local partners now or in a year, this is also some kind of time perspective is also important, because this is where we become vulnerable. Because now, just to share with you maybe one specific reality, if international actors withdraw with half a year notice, then in my staff, which is 60% migrant, I can prepare the people that I am to dismiss for the dismissal. Reality of today is that I had to fire 11 people over the span of 2 weeks, and 70% of the people that I'm laying off are of migrant background, and I'm doing it a week before Christmas. And now, is it kind of healthy? Does it mean that we have done localization well? Because it's a necessity. It's not my choice. I'm doing this because important donors give me information about cuts or funding with 2 weeks notice before Christmas, and I have to take these decisions now. But also it's like, a small indication what the reality of these local partners is, and how healthy these partnership conditions are. And this is really difficult to somehow, find your place in the conditions like this.
I think those are really, really key points, I think, for all of us to take away in conversations that we might have across our organisations, particularly, what you're saying about notice and about that idea of delocalisation happening as the money runs out. It's a really, really interesting idea. Surprises that came up in the 2 years of research?
I'll answer that. Aga's point. I was really, what an amazing visual image, right, that Aga put forward, of that idea of like cooling magma, right? And the idea that it totally applies to, I can't speak less to Polish context than I can to the UK context, in terms of a certain time where I think interviewees said, there was a real feeling of you had certain people round the table in which to affect change. You had civil society groups, you had, various sort of, government ministries and things. And suddenly the feeling was that actually there was flux and, a lot is possible here. And how far can we, like, the doors open a crack? So how far can we, like, slam it open? So that's totally familiar. In terms of the, what surprised me, just to perhaps add something slightly more positive of what we've been talking about. I've been really pleasantly surprised with the extent to which people we've engaged with as part of this work, and not just policy people, but aid users, affected people, Ukrainians, wherever they are, their understanding of solidarity and what solidarity means, I think, is potentially more inclusive than we, I think, give credit for. I think, in terms of what does solidarity mean to you, and we've asked their interpretations. Obviously, you're crossing like different languages and things. There's lots in flux to sort of caveat, but in terms of using a solidarity-based approach or taking elements of a solidarity-based approach, from an organic desire from people to want to help and support, what elements can the humanitarian sector take from that while upholding its, a principled and needs-based approach? I think there's an interesting conversation to be had there in terms of, one expects a certain answer from, if you interview 600 mainly Ukrainian displaced people, about what solidarity means to them, right? In terms of, is it resisting Russian aggression? To be sure, there's, a lot of people say that. I think what was interesting was what else they say in terms of, helping neighbors, helping people in need, regardless of where they are or what their background is. I think there's a bit more of a positive story to be told there. I'm just trying to add to your, the idea of a little voice between lots of different big things moving. I think that's another thing to kind of crack that avenue open, really.
Mariana, anything surprised you particularly?
I will answer to that part of question where Sarian asked about the differences between the cases. And I think my observation here would be that with regard to Ukraine, we should recognize, and this was not there in other case studies, that the humanitarian crisis started in 2014. And the challenges related to localization in Ukraine, it's not something that started right now in 2022, but that's something that started in 2014 when Ukrainian organizations were basically alone or received really little support in reacting to the humanitarian crisis in 2014, 16, 17, which was ongoing and protracted in the east of Ukraine. And it feels like the processes that Polish colleagues are facing right now, Aga, what you mentioned, that's something that a lot of Ukrainian organizations already faced in that years that I mentioned. So the huge increase of staff in 2015-16, and then the decrease of funding, the need to shrink back, the need to find funding, to find a niche in the country, to work with communities. Everything was there. So now it feels like for Ukraine, there is a huge tension between doing the localization, but by actors who invented or reinvented Ukraine as humanitarian crisis in 2022, on one hand, and on the other hand, recognizing the locally led response that was already there and all the learning that is there. So now it feels like from Ukrainian perspective that there is a huge gap between those who are doing localization and those who are doing locally led response. This is my huge surprise, and I think we had a lot of conversations with Sarian why the way Ukrainian actors are working, why we had this first appeal to open letter to donors and international actors from Ukrainian organizations early in 2022, why it happens so, and sometimes Ukrainian organizations being perceived as a bit pushy in terms of trying to protect their interests or area of responsibility. So this is one of my observations between the differences. And the other one also relates to the state and role of state. In Ukraine, it feels like there are, so we can't say that the state is framing the narratives with one strategy or with one approach. So there is definitely this national level where Ukrainian state recognizes the work and the support that international actors are doing on one hand, but on the other hand, let's say, blaming the international actors of not being present enough in the processes related to prisoners of war, being too neutral in terms of the access to occupied territories and so on. That creates an image of international organizations in public perception. So many people told us in interviews, I mean, the people who received support, that they are not trusting this or that organization because in media they were portrayed with a negative image. But on the local level, the local authorities, local governments, they really see the actors, international actors, Ukrainian humanitarian actors as partners, as those with whom they can really support their community, cover or targeting the humanitarian needs, but also thinking how to develop the communities. So I think that this is also the difference in Ukraine, which we haven't seen so much, for example, in Poland and in UK, that the national state is pushing pretty different narratives and the way how they work with humanitarian community in comparison to local actors.
Yeah. Karen, can I come to you and ask an online question or two? You will take a view on how detailed they are.
Yeah, thank you. So we've got 2 questions from our online audience. I'll read them out together. The first one is a little bit of a devil's advocate question, which I like. So when organizations were able to raise so much money for Ukraine, what do we have to gain by trying to challenge some of these narratives if it might also impact the work that can be done in the short term? And the second one is, narratives change over time as conditions and behaviors change. What mechanisms are in place to develop and communicate new narratives for humanitarian actors as the situation changes and new messaging needs arise over time?
Great. Well, I'm going to let my panel have a think about what they want to say and answer a little bit myself, abusing my position as chair. So I think what can be learned from Ukraine? I think obviously from the Disasters Emergency Committee perspective, this appeal was astronomical in comparison to our normal appeals or other appeals that we've had, matched only really by the Asian tsunami 20 years ago, this Boxing Day. I think it's hard to predict sometimes what the UK public is going to respond to quite so passionately. And one of the things that we really sought to do was we recognized that people were willing to accept different examples of what humanitarian response looked like in this context. So for us, the exceptionalism of Ukraine was more that people were already trying to just PayPal cash to people directly. They were trying to book Airbnbs because they understood that if they could get cash to someone, they would be helped in some way that they themselves would like to be helped if they were in that position. So we tried to lean in very, very strongly to cash response, to cash programming, because we felt that there was a broader opening among the UK public of saying, this is what good humanitarian response looks like. This is what I would want. And the idea of that being that if you can accept that, if that can be normalized in a space where you're perhaps more interested than you've been in other crises, you're perhaps more comfortable with it as a concept here, we can normalize that going into, you know, the next appeal was Pakistan floods appeal, or after that it was Turkey, Syria earthquake response. If we've talked about it in Ukraine, you've heard about it more when we're coming to tell you about it in different contexts. So I think that's one of the ways that we were seeking to try and use some of the things that people were more open to in this example to perhaps help us going forward. And I think in terms of responses and narratives changing over time, I think that's right. I think what feels from a very unique model. I recognize that's not everybody's model. We peak very early on in terms of how much we say to people in the early days, hopefully usually, of a crisis. And that messaging often doesn't have very much detail in it. It piggybacks an awful lot on what the news media is saying. But what we've been trying to do more of, and what we're trying to do more in our strategy, is in the reporting back space. And I suppose that's where I'm talking about some of my frustrations around some really strong, I think really powerful narrative work that addresses a lot of the issues that have raised and has time and space to talk about context and time and space to talk about what has changed since we asked you for this money. Although we are also putting money behind trying to get that out and reaching audiences, it's never as big as the audience we reach when we ask them for money in the first place, which is so heavily dependent on the media narrative. So I think, again, it's trying to find those spaces in between and seed ideas and go with where the energy is. And I'm really struck by what Aga was saying about what's working, what's landing. How can we shift towards what people are wanting to hear, are already thinking, and bring in some of these humanitarian principles and humanitarian imperatives into that. Colleagues on the panel, who's keen to address some of those?
Super briefly on the second question, and just like jumping off exactly from where you finished, you know, in terms of the mechanisms for like new narratives in the sector and stuff, it's this now. Like it's a totally iterative process, isn't it? And it's really, I'm so pleased that, you know, like Hannah could join us, because Hannah just has a different role to like a lot of what we do in the sector. And it's these common spaces, right, which are really rare, even within organizations, right? The ability that like these like two super powerful departments, not, you know, perhaps having as much contact as perhaps they should, you know, to, you know, uphold policy commitments that they've had around localization. How does that square with like the fundraising side of things? So yeah, I would say it's the mechanisms are iterative, and they're here, and you know we work on them all the time, right? So yeah.
And maybe, yeah, just to add to that, I think it's a really good question, because going into 2025, it's a very uncertain, there's a lot of uncertainty for Ukraine, and the picture is becoming much more complicated with a lot more nuances in it. So you kind of have a lot of actors talking about recovery and building up that component of the response. You still have people with really high humanitarian needs. And at times those can kind of be a bit competing, this kind of where we shift our focus and how we think about the picture within Ukraine, and where the needs are and what the vulnerabilities are. So it's going to become, I think, a lot more nuanced. And so how we communicate about that, and what we say, and the narratives that we are part of and that we are setting, and the kind of experiences of communities when they're experiencing these different components of the realities of living in a war, coupled with a geopolitics that are certainly going to have an impact on Ukraine. I think it's a timely discussion to have, because I think it's something that all of us are going to have to think about very carefully moving forward.
Great. Any more burning questions from the room? Fantastic. Didn't give you long there, did I? Because we're dangerously close to finishing, close to time. I'd really like to bring in Sylvia Colonna. Sorry, I nearly gave you an extra I at the end and then wanted to check. From British Red Cross. You obviously were involved in making this piece of research happening. I think, if anything, today's discussion has shown just how rich and vital the conversation in the report is. I wonder if you just wanted to say a few words to finish off about why you wanted to fund this work, and what you see as the importance of it.
Kind of speaks for itself, this debate. But thank you very much for the very insightful discussion. I've been participating in events and workshops throughout the project from the inception to now, and each single time I've always learned something. I've always been inspired by the questions, by the ideas you have generated. So I'm deeply grateful for your knowledge and your research. The collaboration between the British Red Cross and HPG began at the very onset of the crisis, of the conflict in Ukraine. At that time, we were grappling with the complexities and the dilemmas posed by the application of humanitarian principles in such a challenging context. And British Red Cross found in HPG a sounding board and an unmatchable resource to help us articulate those dilemmas, to help us articulate those complexities, in fact. So in collaboration with HPG, but also in conversations where colleagues in the sector, in the government, with colleagues in media, for example, we started really exploring those issues at the intersection of principled humanitarian donorship, donors' foreign policy strategies, and the role of public narratives. Those narratives are shaped by the governments, are shaped by the media, by the public opinion, but also are shaped as humanitarian actors themselves, have been influential in the way decision-making has been made around the humanitarian response in Ukraine, in Russia, but also in Western countries and beyond. So that has had an exponential impact globally. So we then decided to fund this work because we recognize the profound impact the narratives have on shaping humanitarian response in Ukraine as well as elsewhere, of course. So narratives are not just stories, they are really impactful, powerful tools that influence perceptions, drive policy decisions, and mobilize resources. So we felt that by understanding and learning how to engage with the complexities of these narratives, we can then ensure that humanitarian efforts, humanitarian diplomacy in particular, are more effective, more principled, and really aligned with the needs of people who need our help. And when I look back at the questions we started with less than 3 years ago, which sadly coincides with the escalation of the conflict then, I can see the journey of our thinking. We started with the dilemmas, but perhaps they were not dilemmas as such. Perhaps we didn't mean to, they were not meant to be articulated as dilemmas. This research, I think, sheds light on nuances, complexities, and very importantly for us, on the coexistence of principles, of values, of narratives, and how that coexist in a very fluid environment. There is no dichotomy that's my takeaway. There's no dichotomy between neutrality and solidarity. There needs not be a resilience or vulnerability are not binary ideas, in fact, nor are local and international either. I mean, they really coexist, and this is the complexity of it. So for me, the lesson is really to embrace the complexities, to resist oversimplification when possible. We all need to simplify in our jobs sometimes, but also to be ready to take the opportunity to learn, evolve, and adapt our approaches as we go forward. I think these are opportunities that come at a human cost for many, and this is only the right thing to do for us and an obligation to be humble and learn from it every time we can. And then just to conclude, for me, some opportunities have been presented to us through this crisis and through this project as well, but also they're already there, they have been there for a long time. And here I would like to emphasize, for example, the importance of embracing local leadership, for example, in these kind of responses, empowering local actors who have a deep understanding of their communities, which will allow us to avoid traps of, categories of vulnerabilities, for example. This is not old news. This is still a new, compelling narrative fit for the 21st century. And a narrative that tells a story on humanitarian principles, for sure, but also a story about people, equality, partnership, and progress. Second point I take away is strengthening resilience. Again, it may sound new, it may sound old, but it's really not, and it's way more complex than sometimes we like to think. It involves also maintaining society's capability and functionality under extreme duress. It involves, for example, creating partnerships aimed at the establishment of the legal and procedural processes required to protect, to leverage and mobilize populations during the transition period from peace to war. And it's very relevant right now and in so many places, sadly. And then collaboration, of course. Partnerships are at the essence of resilience, and fostering stronger partnerships with no expiry date should be really something that we can invest on. And then the last point is about neutrality. There's a lot in this report about neutrality, about resistance, and our takeaway is that obviously political participation, political action is a way to care about humans and drive attention and resources to the populations we want to continue to serve. But while the principle of solidarity has been, has reemerged in this crisis as a counterpoint to neutrality, I think it really didn't need to do that. And this is what we learned also through this amazing project. It is for humanitarians an operational approach, and we want to maintain it that way, an approach that ensures access, to all affected populations and build trust with all parties involved, but also it's an approach that needs to be applied in a flexible and context sensitive way. It's a lot to take on through this research, and I really thank you for that. So I would like to extend a heartfelt thank you from the British Red Cross for taking this forward for us. It's an instrumental research in advancing our understanding on improving the way we engage with narratives, and we're going to incrementally learn and move on from there. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. And I guess, huge thanks from all of us here to the British Red Cross for funding the research. Thanks to the authors of the report. I think it's a fantastic piece of work and something that we all can learn from and take forward. I think what we've heard today, I've heard a real challenge about this isn't something we're looking back on. This is something that is happening now. We have the opportunity to go out and shape narratives, and maybe the space is closing. So maybe the time is now, maybe the time is today. I was really thinking about your point about people being and, not or. So victims and resistors, not or. And a reminder again from what Sylvia was saying, ultimately these narratives are difficult because they try and tell one story about hundreds, thousands, if not millions of individual humans, and every human is multifaceted and arguably imperfect. And that's why narratives are always so difficult, because they're trying to pull from a range of wildly different individuals into one story that will work. So again, this is hard. We should be heartened from the conversation and the learning that we've done today. I would really like to thank all of the speakers on the panel for their time and their generosity and their openness in answering the comments. And my challenge, I think, going out from here to those online and those who've joined us in the room is go back out and talk about this. Tell a colleague you wouldn't normally talk to about this. What was the one thing that you found interesting about this report or this conversation this morning? I imagine HPG would also like me to say, if you want to share it online, that wouldn't be awful. But just to end, a huge thank you and congratulations on the report.